Hi everybody, it's Will. Going to spend a bit of time just today talking about a few things. All of this stuff is relevant to the assessment. So there's a bit of a preamble where I talk about a thing called embedded counselling. But understanding what embedded counselling is really crucial to understanding particularly the first part of the assessment where you have to investigate and explore counselling skills with respect to some particular context, such as the workplace, school, and so on. So essentially, what we're going to be looking at here is focusing on counselling skills. This whole module really is not about trying to train you to become counsellors. I think we probably mentioned that in the very first lecture, that this module isn't about turning you into counsellors. What it is about is exploring and trying to help you acquire particular skills which, if you acquire them effectively, would be useful ultimately in a counselling context. So it's important to recognise when we go back to the assessment, which is the third thing we're going to talk about, is that the assessment, particularly part one, the first part about the different contexts, is really about the application of skills to a particular context. Given a particular situation, what skills might be relevant? I'll say more about this later. We're not asking the question, given a particular context, what might you do as a counsellor to fix that situation? Because that is something that's way beyond the scope of this module. We're focusing on skills, not about abilities. So we're going to be looking at this. So the skills are important, and there are particular individuals who can be called embedded counsellors, or we can look at embedded counselling skills. And really what an embedded counsellor is somebody who is not employed necessarily as a counsellor themselves, but they have counselling training which enables them to use these skills in order for them to better interact in the particular situation that they're working in. And just to give you some examples of these may be GPs, they may be social workers, they may be teachers, all of who've been given the skills, just like you have, so that when a particular situation arises, they're better able to manage that situation, or even they're better able to prevent particular difficult situations arising in the first place by interacting with people in a reflective and intelligent way, using some of the skills we've talked about over the past few weeks. So then we're going to talk about the assessment report. So embedded counsellors, there is a confusion about what a counsellor is, what a psychotherapist is, what a counselling skill is, what an embedded counsellor is. But essentially, an embedded counsellor is difference in terms of the intention of the individual. Counsellors enter a particular contract to help the client. So there's a contract there, and the client is there to be helped by the counsellor, and the counsellor, as you know, because we've discussed it many times, is bound by various ethical frameworks such as the BACP, the British Association for Counsellors and Psychotherapists, or various other organisations, which tells them how they should and should not behave toward particular clients. We've seen things like beneficence, non-maleficence, and avoiding conflicts of interest, and so on and so forth. That's a counsellor. An embedded counsellor do not have such a contractual obligation. You do not have, if you're an embedded counsellor, a responsibility to help your particular client because no contract exists. But, as I mentioned, the skills that they have may be used in order to ease and facilitate the particular interaction or the particular position, particular job, if you like, that individual has with other people. So as you can see, hopefully, this is starting to hopefully make that first piece of assessment make a little bit of sense, because what we're not trying to say is how would you fix this broken person? We're trying to say what skills might be relevant given a situation in a particular context, such as a workplace or a hospital or something like that. Embedded counsellors will include people like nurses, they will include people like teachers, they will include people like line managers. Now, this is not to suggest that all teachers, all nurses, and all line managers have counselling skills. Some of them do, and the idea is that actually this helps them in their particular job. It helps them to understand a particular, if you've got a patient, for example, if you're a nurse who has a particular person that they're dealing with, they're trying to treat them, and this person is unresponsive to the interaction. They're not interacting with the nurse. They're not maintaining eye contact. They seem a little bit unwilling to enter into the treatment. Then what does the nurse do? Does the nurse grab hold of the person and force them to have the treatment? Probably not a good idea. But a nurse with suitable skills, and these skills may be counselling skills, may recognise that what that person needs is to be treated with respect, to be treated with empathy, to be given some kind of unconditional positive regard, to be taken seriously. They may not speaking because they may have certain underlying worries. They're scared of the treatment. They're scared of the medical professionals. Having an understanding of these kind of things can very much help that nurse to treat that person more effectively and make that person hopefully be more likely to seek help in the future. You put them a good experience, the patient a good experience, rather than a bad experience, and that obviously will make people more likely to seek help out than if they had a bad experience. I think we've all had situations like this where people, if they were dealt with you with a little bit more empathy, you would very probably be more responsive to that kind of interaction in the future. So they're not primarily a counsellor, they're primarily a nurse. A teacher is primarily a teacher, a line manager is a line manager. But both teachers have to deal with children. Again, they may be unresponsive, they may be showing signs of anxiety. The teacher's job isn't to treat the child's anxiety, but it might be to explore how the child is feeling, which may then allow them to recommend that child gets additional treatment, or speak to the parents, or not speak to the parents because it might be something to do with the parents, etc., etc. Line managers deal with people, and dealing with people in an empathetic way, trying to understand how people are responding to particular good and bad news and changes in roles, can very much aid the process of the employee's situation, aid the process of transition. So it's a secondary role which can support the primary role of being a nurse, being a teacher, being a line manager. So communication skills can enhance the communication with others to enable them to more effectively function, and there's references at the end. So there's an activity here, and obviously we would have done this as a group activity, but it might be worth just reflecting yourself on some of these situations. I mean, you may think back to your school days. Are there any instances where a teacher maybe used counselling skills, where a teacher showed empathy towards you, took you seriously, showed unconditional positive regard? Again, we're not saying that the teacher cured me of anxiety or something like that. We're just saying in the way that the teacher interacted. Did they use paraphrasing? Did they use active listening? Did they use open questions rather than closed questions? Did they listen to you? So I want you to think back about that. So have a little think, just reflect. You could do it now, you could do it later, you could pause the screencast. I will carry on, however. The second part, and should be an acknowledgement of this in part one, in the first part of the assessment, is that teachers are obviously under a certain amount of constraints, as are nurses, as are line managers, which prevent them from being the same as professional counsellors. Okay, so there are organisations, just like psychotherapists have to work within the rules of the BACP or whatever other psychotherapeutic or counselling ethical framework they've been presented with or provided with. Teachers also have a duty of care towards the people that they're working with, which will limit the kinds of things they can and cannot do. So we'll look later, but there are, whichever particular scenario you choose for that first part, that the important thing is to look up the demands of the particular organisation and see if you can say what the limitations of a teacher, a line manager are within that particular framework. So there are limits. It is not permissible for example, a teacher to give a child cognitive behavioural therapy. Right, that's not allowed because they're not being governed by psychotherapeutic ethical frameworks. You could be sued. So there are limitations on it. There are things you should do, do's and don'ts. So it's important to look those up. So school settings, counselling skills, very important. Lots of children may, particularly if they're entering secondary school for the first time, they may feel very intimidated. They may find that difficult that transition difficult to manage. They suddenly become from being the very big kids in the school, the very biggest kids in the school, to the very smallest kids in the school. Often the secondary schools are more hostile in the way they run things. Kids are expected to work on their own more. It's a lot less friendly environment in many respects. And managing these kind of things like transitions from schools is an important part of a teacher's role. Again, the teacher is not a counsellor, but if that teacher has counselling skills, that teacher may better facilitate, grease the wheels, if you like, of the way that child transitions from one school to the other, listening to the child, recognising that a child might feel intimidated, so they may be behaving aggressively in the classroom. Well, is that aggression to do with the fact that they're just angry, or is that aggression due to the fact that they may feel insecure? So again, active listening, empathy, unconditional positive regard, listening, taking kids seriously, open questions, all these kind of things. Go back to the slides in the workshops. These are all in here. So we're trying to do these things, trying to make people feel safe, understood, respected, valued, and listened to. And this applies not just to pupils, but parents. Various other things to do with bullying, social media, family difficulties, separation and bereavement. But again, let's not go for the big things. We're not expecting you to show, how help a child who's gone through a bereavement or something like that. We're not trying to help them. We're trying to maybe put them in a place where they may be able to get help by helping them by using these skills. Health settings, GPs, for example, can use counselling skills. Research shows that GPs who have counselling training have better relationships with their patients, increased patient satisfaction and adherence and health outcome. In the old days, a doctor was very autocratic, and it was usually a male, and the person would come in, could feel quite intimidated by this quite academic, autocratic seeming individual, and maybe wouldn't open up, wouldn't really say what the problem was, wouldn't say what their fears were about taking a particular medication, or their worries that they might have some incurable disease. By using counselling skills, things such as, again, active listening, keep going through the same things, active listening, eye contact, non-verbal communication, listening, all these kind of things, trying to calm that patient down. This is a person that I can speak to. I can tell this person about my worries because this person isn't going to shout at me or tell me I'm being ridiculous. Nurse-patient relationships, similarly, again, counselling training can help both physical and mental illnesses when the nurse isn't a particular mental illness trained nurse. That's not part of their role. This is a secondary role. And same for social workers as well. Therapeutic skills can help client satisfaction and success. So these are really important. This is why this is an incredibly important module. Counselling is not just about what happens in a room with a couch and a client. This is something which happens in every possible social interaction. Whether you're in a shop, whether you're dealing with somebody on a helpline, using counselling skills can allow you to get what you want, and it can help the other person get what they want too. Mental health nurses can use counselling too. Again, not necessarily, they're not trying to fix the patient, but they're trying to recognise the importance between the mental health nurse and the patient. Counselling skills are central in this particular relationship, as we've discussed. Trust, we talk in counselling about the therapeutic relationship. In an interaction with a patient, trust is part of the therapeutic relationship. Building trust is part of the relationship between a nurse and the patient. Genuineness, warmth, friendliness, empathy, that kind of thing. Active listening skills are shown again to be a useful thing. In the workplace, the workplace is less well regulated, but there's the Health and Safety Council, there's various organisations, there's some links in a bit. They tend to be different from different organisations, will have different rules, but you can get a general idea of the duty of care and the rights and responsibilities that a manager has towards the manager's subordinates, and also managers have to other managers, and so on and so forth. So again, there are certain regulations which specify what a manager, somebody in a boardroom, for example, in that particular workplace setting, should or shouldn't do in a particular situation. I know a whole bunch of these, but health and safety at work is one of the simple ones that you might want to look at. So Social workers use these things, and we can see this is a piece of research here which shows things like attention giving, active listening, empathy, genuineness, and so on are very widely used. Giving people it's simple things which seem obvious, but often busy social workers can whisk into a situation and just not communicate effectively, and the person who's been discussion with, could be a child, could be an adult, is feeling not listened to, they're feeling talked down to, they're feeling patronized. That's not going to help sort the problems out. So using genuineness, reflecting, summary, all these counselling skills, very important in social workers. There are conflicts, as I've mentioned. Pupil-teacher relationship is based on authority. Teachers can have the right to tell pupils what to do, and the pupil, within certain limits, obviously, is required to follow those rules, follow the school rules. If the teacher tells them to stop running down the corridor, the pupil should stop running down the corridor. And if the pupil doesn't stop running down the corridor, then it is legitimate to place some form of sanction on that student, that pupil, maybe giving them detention, something like that. So there's a legitimate power relationship, right? Whereas a counsellor has no such legitimate authority over the client. They can make suggestions, but often that is not necessarily the best idea to make suggestions. Sometimes, because quite often, as we know, the motivation has to come from the client, not from the counsellor. So it's a different kind of thing. But whatever situation you're in, you need to be aware of power dynamics. People often aren't aware of the fact that they have a particular power relationship with somebody else. They don't realise that people are frightened when they're in that situation. I mentioned GPs earlier on. The GPs may not realise that the patients felt frightened when they walk into the surgery. Trying to understand these power dynamics is an important thing. And so they're kind of restrictions on what you can and cannot do in particular situations. Nurses, there are legal requirements for nurses. You've got to keep the patient alive. Difference there between counsellors who value individual autonomy. Remember the workshop, I think probably the first workshop or one of the earlier workshops, when we talked about what ethically a counsellor should or should not disclose. So is it permissible for a counsellor to suggest that stop a person who's threatening to commit suicide? It's an ethical debate, but some people argue that we need to respect a person's autonomy. The Samaritans, for example, will say, we will not try to stop you from killing yourself, but by discussing with us your problems, that might lead you to be less likely to want to kill yourself. The reason why is that the Samaritans know that if somebody who's on the verge of thinking of killing themselves, or on the verge of killing themselves, believes that the Samaritans will try to talk them out of it, they may not ring them up. Better to have that discussion within the context of, we're not going to persuade you not to do this, but we are going to talk about the situation. Always mention the workplace. The manager has a power relationship with the person who may need help from them, and there may be a sense in which they feel they do not want to be completely honest with the manager, because the manager might sanction them for having whatever problem it is they have. We see this quite a lot with people in the caring professions not wishing to seek psychological help for problems that they may suffer as a result of the burnout they're suffering from their job working as a nurse or a care worker, because they don't want the human resources department to find out that they've got psychological problems, or they've been seeing a counsellor, because that might affect things like promotion. Okay, so essay there, it's this template 10. Let's ignore that. This is the first essay. Essay 1. It's a 1,500 word discussion on how counselling related skills can be used in 2 of the following work-based settings. Primary, there's a big list there. What we want you to do, as it says towards the bottom there, is to pick a topic, pick a context, and we want you to identify a potential situation that might arise. Right, so that could be a child not wanting, not speaking in class. It could be a patient in a medical ward not wanting to take their medication. It could be conflict in a boardroom, that kind of stuff. That's the situation. And as I've mentioned before, more than once, the goal is not for you to say, if somebody was a child and I was a teacher and that child was not speaking in the classroom, or if somebody in an eating disorders clinic was not engaging with therapy, I would do this and I would do this to them. That's not what we're asking you to do. We're not asking you to say what you would do, because you're not trying to fix these people. All we're asking you to do is to identify relevant counselling skills that you might think might help this situation. And I think, as all of these cases, fewer counselling skills rather than more. I mean, you think about it, we've got 2 of these, that's 750 words. If you decide to focus on active listening, empathy, unconditional positive regard, paraphrasing, non-verbal communication, you're not going to be able to say very much about them. So pick the ones that you think are most appropriate, pick the ones that you think are most interesting or relevant, pick the ones that you think you can say most about, and do fewer rather than more. It may just be one thing that you describe. That might be perfect, might be 2, but avoid trying to do dozens, because you end up saying nothing about lots and lots of things. So it's important. We want you to try to identify ethical issues that might be relevant. Very short bit, more on this in a minute. And this particularly relates not to the BSCP, because you're not governed by the BSCP. In this imaginary world, you would be governed by the regulations that regulate teachers, nurses, social workers, or people in organisations, a boardroom setting. Slides, links on that. So identify, that's brief. This just say what your role is. So identify that what you're doing is within the limitations, within the boundaries of what is considered to be ethically okay. Which is why you wouldn't say, if a child came in and they were being quiet, what I'd do is I'd give them a dysfunctional thought record. I'd get them to engage in behavioural experiments. No, you can't do that, because that would not be within the ethical framework that you, as a teacher, have to operate within. You're not a counsellor. So the BSCP is over there for the moment. This is about embedded counselling, not counsellors. And the strengths and limitations. Again, that might be fairly brief, but you just need to recognise that maybe certain there are limitations to certain things. They might work, they might not work, but that, again, fairly brief, that part. So you might want to consider this. We're going to be running some drop-in centre sessions in a few weeks. We're going to be using phones and hopefully video conferencing software. We're going to create a discussion board on Blackboard where you can ask questions. But before you start to ask questions, it might be worth considering what you which essay you might, which topic you might do. Ignore again template 10. I should have updated these slides. Consider the essay in essay 1. Begin to plan your essay. Which work-based setting you're going to be doing? What is your job, role, and responsibility? So it might be easiest to say teacher if you're in a school, or social worker if you're in that kind of environment, rather than some other role. But it's up to you. If you're a teaching assistant rather than a teacher, if you're experiencing that might be something that you wish to do. What duty of care do you have to the people in that setting? So that's a very brief bit about the kind of ethical framework that you have, that you work within. What skills might be important in that role, and what issues might arise in those settings. So think about that. This is a suggested outline. These words are approximate, so please don't think that these are fixed and we're going to count them up and penalise you if you're 1 word over or 2 words below. It's just a vague idea about how to structure, because you've got 750 words for each, and I believe this adds up to 750. So what's the setting? So physical setting, is it a school? That won't take you very long. Who are the people that are relevant in this particular situation? Is it a teacher? Is it another teacher if you pick that environment? Is it conflict between teachers? Is it a child? Is it a young child, an old child? Whatever. What are the roles and responsibilities of the people? And then the situation that arose. What is the situation that arose in? So is it a child who doesn't want to speak? Is it conflict within the boardroom? You get the idea. Is it somebody potentially bullying somebody else? Is it somebody in a boardroom who will not shut up? How do you tell somebody to shut up? Well, you could tell them to shut up, but that might cause more problems than it starts. Is there some way in which you could use counselling skills in order to, in a more reasonable way, solve that particular problem with somebody refusing to keep talking and liking the sound of their own voice. What does the governing body say about the situation? So what are the rights, what are the roles and responsibilities of you from the ethical point of view? So roles and responsibilities in the setting, the one I just mentioned, is about that you're a teacher and your job is to teach kids. This is about identifying what the responsibilities and the ethical framework is that governs that. Very short, that 100 words, right? Again, it could be 50 words, might be 120 words, but you've got to, if you're going to put more words in there, you've got to take less words. You've got to take some words from somewhere else. Needs. What do you think the client needs, given the framework and setting? What would you think they need to do? Okay. Now that, again, might be briefer than that. So the needs of where somebody might shut up, it might not be that person's needs, it might be the needs of everybody else who's not getting a word in edgeways. So we need to just say what is the problem, what are the needs here, and then finally, what are the skills? I wouldn't necessarily use these as headings. They're not terribly useful as headings, but basically think about just describing it as what is the situation you're in and the problem, what is the particular ethical framework that you're in, what is the problem that needs to be solved. So you've described the thing, what would you like to happen, and a child becoming happier, a child becoming more engaged, or somebody being quiet, or conflict reducing, or somebody in an eating disorders clinic will be more likely to take their medication. So what skills might help that particular situation? And again, it's not about fixing that person. It's about just using skills. What skills are relevant to help what skills are relevant to that particular situation? Here are some professional bodies. So we've got the social workers there. You can click on that link. The Nursing and Midwifery Council, there's the ethical framework of there. The General Teaching Council, which governs teachers. And although, as I mentioned, we've got things such as the rights and responsibilities of people in organisations, differs from organisation to organisation. There are government and EU specified framework which says what should and shouldn't happen in these particular situations. So that's essay 1. I hope that's helped. Oh, references. We're not expecting massive amounts of references. We're not really expecting an introduction or anything like that. We just want you to go, this is the first situation, this is the second situation. Don't waste words. You've got 750 words, so spend your words talking about the situation and the skills and all that kind of stuff for the first one. Let's go back. Let's not spend a load of time talking about, in this essay I will be discussing two. Yeah, we know that. Just the first one will be, you write as a heading, workplace setting, describe the setting, go through. You might want to put references in there. You might want to put references to any ethical practices, put references to the relevant skills and the usefulness of those particular skills. So there will be references in there. This one, not massive amounts necessarily, we'll leave that up to you, but a few references to relevant skills. Again, if you go back to the slides that we looked at and the slides today, there are references to things that would help, that you might help to put in there. And going back to the workshop, same thing, references to active listening, what are the limitations of active listening, paraphrasing, empathy, all that kind of stuff, what are the pros and cons. So there will be a few references in there. For essay 2, or template 11 as it's meaninglessly called, so again, please ignore that. We want you to write the same amount now, so we've reduced it from 2,000, but based upon that particular skills practice that you did a number of weeks ago. And we want you to use Kolb's learning cycle to reflect upon your experiences engaging in this particular session. So essentially, if we think about reflection, and there may be more on this on the next slide, but what reflection is in my world is an answer to the question, if I was to do something similar to this again, how would I do it? Right? In many respects, humans tend to sometimes repeat their mistakes over and over again, maybe people get into the same kind of experience, the same problems in relationship after relationship. Relationships always end up conflictual, or people always end up arguing with people in shops or something like that. And that's fine if that's the way you want to live your life, repeating the same unhappy experiences over and over again. And so the question is, so what reflection is all about is to say, well, let's consider that experience. Let's consider why things went well in this particular experience or why things went badly in this experience. And let's try and see if I can learn from this experience so that the next time something like this happens, and it may not be exactly the same, but something similar to this happens, maybe I could do something different which would prevent history from repeating itself. So reflection is really taking a kind of forensic analysis of the situation in which you found yourself. Somebody wasn't answering, you're asking questions and they were only answering in single words in an interview, or maybe you always end up in an argument with people. When you start off with a friendly discussion, it always ends up in an argument. Now, the natural thing for people to do usually is to blame the other person and say, well, the reason is because they're argumentative, or the reason is because they've got nothing interesting to say. Well, that's possible, and there's no sense in which that is not true. But it's also possible there's something about what you were doing, or maybe there's something about the situation in general. The particular room it was in might have been intimidating, or whatever it had to be, the clothes you wore, the way you looked at them, that kind of thing. So we're trying to identify these experiences and analyze them and say, well, why might this experience have happened in the way that it happened, and what might I do to improve things? So it's a really fairly deep analysis, thinking about how you were, how the other people were, how the situation was, the fact that there was a camera there, the fact that you were in a small room, the fact that it was really hot or really cold or whatever it is, and then try to conclude by saying, well, what have we learned about this? What might I do differently next time? So some kind of action plan. How can I make sure that if I'm in a similar situation again, I try to stop this from happening, or I try to make this good thing happen? I mean, you could always do reflections on great things too. Oh, this went really well. Why did this thing go so well? Right? So analyze that. This is less obviously done, less commonly done. But what was it about this particular situation? The stars seemed to be aligned. Well, maybe it wasn't the stars that aligned that made it so good. Maybe it was just a fact that the way you were, or the way they were, or the room, or whatever it was what. And then you can say, well, I will try in future to recreate these particular conditions to do it again. So it's a very kind of analytical, almost scientific, without the experiments, evaluation of a particular situation which tries to help us to learn. It's all about learning. It's about not repeating the same mistakes over and over again, and trying to repeat our successes over and over again. We know that some of you didn't attend the skills session, so if you weren't able to do that, or if you can always do the same thing, but take a particular experience you had in one of the counselling related workshops, so where we did the little exercises with people. We had to talk about your holiday, or talk about why you did psychology. So like this, to pick on one of those, but do exactly the same thing. What was it what things went wrong? Maybe one thing, it may be two things, but again, we want you to say more about fewer things rather than less about lots and lots of different problems or situations. So you might pick two, you might pick three, you might pick one, depends how much you've got to say about it. Focus on the ones you think are most interesting, relevant, easy to change, whatever, and spend time discussing it, rather than loads of times talking about, rather than very few words talking about 6 or 7 different problems that you had in a session, where you think, I'm not really getting the chance to say much about this. This will probably have very few references. We want to emphasize that this is reflection. This is about learning. This is about you considering how you are in a particular situation. This is not really about academic work. This is an incredibly important skill for counsellors, because counsellors find themselves in situations, and quite often in counselling situations, things don't go well. The client might get the wrong end of the stick. I think the therapist is judging them in some way. So as part of their training, therapists and counsellors will have supervision in which they discuss these situations with a more experienced counsellor or therapist. And so, why did it go wrong? What did you do? I don't know. Maybe I had a look on my face. Maybe I wasn't nodding enough. Maybe I wasn't being, engaged enough. Maybe, I was struggling a little bit at that time because I was thinking about some other problem, and maybe I dropped out of the conversation and they thought I wasn't listening to them. Blah, 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 blah. We're trying to look at you, look at them, and this is not about beating yourself up. It's not about you saying, I was at fault. nor is it about saying they were at fault. Right? It's about neither of those two things. What it's about is fully analysing the whole situation. So at the end, you can, with some degree of confidence, say, actually, the reason was they were at fault. I've looked at all the possibilities. It might have been me. Maybe it was them. You probably won't do this in the session that we're doing because you're, as a counsellor, it's very difficult to blame the client for the situation. You're the counsellor. Okay, so you're probably thinking about how you might change yourself or the situation in order to make things better. But it's not about blaming yourself. It's about saying, well, it is something about them, but I, as their client, as a therapist, have to work with the way they are. I can't change them. I mean, we hope they change themselves, but I can't change the way they're responding to me. All I can do is change the way I am to maybe engage with them better. And you can hopefully see similarities between the first one there. We're using counselling skills to try and help people, not just to fix people. We're trying to use counselling skills here to facilitate the interaction. What could you do differently? So not too many references. In this, you might want to put a few in if you think it's relevant, but only when you think it's relevant. It's about you reflecting. Very important. Yes, so reflective practice. Kolb came up with a model of this in which he says basically there's a continuous process of 4 stages. Step 1, concrete experience. That's the experience you've had. Reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. The reason why he says it's a continuous process is you keep going round and round. Once you've had the active experimentation, you then do it again. You have the concrete experience. You then have the reflective observation, and basically you're making hopefully small steps towards a positive outcome. Now, this is what we hoped you would do when we had 2 sessions, 2 skill sessions. You would look at the first one, think of an experience, think about how we might do it, think about what was going on in that situation. So what the abstract conceptualization, you're trying to say, what are the various factors that might be involved in this particular thing? How might I, what might I do in the future? What might have gone wrong? What might have gone right? This is where you're evaluating the situation. Why did it go wrong? Why did it go right? The active experimentation would be a kind of action plan. This is what I will do next time. And then you go and test it out and you have a concrete experience. So the active experimentation in this situation, there is no active experimentation because you never got to the second part. So the step 4 would be in the form of an action plan. These are the things that I will try to do in order to improve next time. Really important to show reflection. This is not just about you describing a situation and blaming other people. Okay. It's about you analysing the event, thinking about it in more depth from different perspectives, maybe using a bit of theory and research, but remember, this is much more about you reflecting than putting loads of references in. Thinking about what it means to you in your profession or as a student. You're a student at this point. What does all this mean? How does it affect you? Feelings can be in there too. This is not just an abstract thing. I felt this experience happened. I felt quite, upset about it. I felt quite guilty about it. I felt quite embarrassed about it. So it's important to consider not just academic things, but feelings too. So it's a very personal thing. And trying to show that you're considering things, you're evaluating things, and then coming to some kind of conclusions, which say, this is what I might do in the future, is very important and very powerful. And that's why it's an important part of this module and why it's an important part of counselling. So there's some additional assessment related readings here if you want, and then there's another page of them here. These slides are available on Blackboard. As I say, we're going to set more stuff up. We're going to set a FAQ up, and as information comes in, I may prepare some more screencasts such as this if there's a need for them, if we feel they help. Okay, thank you very much.